The frozen moon of Seven had kept its secrets for 3 million years. Beneath layers of ice and ancient rock, something waited in the darkness, something that would change the galaxy forever. Was the leader of the excavation team. He was a tall creature with silver skin and 4 arms that moved with perfect grace. His people were known throughout the galaxy for their intelligence and their belief that they were destined to rule all other species. When his team broke through the final layer of frozen earth and discovered the temple below, felt certain that the universe had delivered a gift meant only for his kind. The temple was enormous. Its walls were made of a black stone that absorbed light instead of reflecting it. Strange symbols covered every surface, written in a language that no living species could read. The air inside was cold and still, untouched by time. Led his team through the winding corridors, their equipment casting pale beams of light into the endless dark. At the center of the temple, they found the chamber. It was a circular room with a high ceiling that disappeared into shadow. In the middle of the floor stood a pedestal made of pure crystal, clear as water and harder than any known material. And resting in that pedestal, embedded in the crystal as if it had grown there, was a sword. The blade was beautiful. It shimmered with colors that had no name, shifting and changing as approached. The hilt was wrapped in a material that looked like leather, but felt like nothing he had ever touched. Ancient inscriptions circled the base of the pedestal, carved deep into the crystal. Called for his translation team. For 3 days they worked on the inscriptions, using every tool and database available to the Galactic Coalition. Finally, they decoded the message. Only the worthy shall wield the blade of ethos. In the grip of the chosen, the stars themselves shall kneel. Smiled when he heard those words. He believed he understood what they meant. The precursors, the ancient civilization that had built this temple and then vanished from existence, had left behind a weapon of unimaginable power, and they had left a test to determine who deserved to claim it. He stepped forward and wrapped 2 of his hands around the hilt of the sword. He pulled with all his strength. The sword did not move. He pulled harder, using all 4 arms, straining until his muscles burned and his silver skin turned dark with effort. The sword remained fixed in place as if it were part of the crystal itself. Tried for hours. He used machines designed to cut through starship hulls. He used energy beams capable of melting mountains. Nothing worked. The sword would not move. News of the discovery spread across the galaxy within days. Every species wanted to know about the ancient temple, the mysterious sword, and the promise of power hidden in those carved words. The Galactic Coalition declared the site a protected zone and invited representatives from all member species to attempt the trial. They came by the thousands. They arrived first. They were a warrior race, massive creatures with bone-plated skin and claws that could tear through metal. Their champion was a general named, a living legend who had conquered entire star systems with his bare hands. He stood 9 feet tall and weighed more than a ground transport vehicle. When he entered the chamber, the observers fell silent with respect and fear. Approached the pedestal without hesitation. He wrapped his claws around the hilt and pulled. His muscles bulged beneath his armored skin. His feet cracked the stone floor as he braced himself. He roared with effort, a sound that echoed through the temple and made the walls tremble. For 10 minutes, he fought against the sword, refusing to accept defeat. The sword did not move. Collapsed to his knees, breathing hard, his body trembling with exhaustion. He looked at the blade with hatred in his eyes. Then he stood and walked away without speaking a word. The came next. They were different from the in every way. Their bodies were thin and fragile, their skin pale and almost transparent. But their minds were powerful beyond measure. They could move objects with their thoughts, read memories from across a room, and see glimpses of possible futures. Their high priestess, an ancient being named, believed that the sword required mental strength rather than physical force. She placed her hands on the pedestal and closed her eyes. She reached out with her mind, searching for the consciousness within the blade, trying to communicate with whatever force held it in place. The observers watched in silence as her body began to glow with psionic energy. Then she screamed, fell backward, her eyes wide with terror. Her attendants rushed to her side and carried her from the chamber. Later, when she recovered enough to speak, she said only one thing. The sword had looked into her soul and found her unworthy. It had rejected her completely. Months passed. Species after species sent their greatest champions to attempt the trial. Though a race of living machines tried to analyze and replicate the blade, they failed. Though a species that existed partially outside normal space and time tried to reach through dimensions to free the sword, they failed. Though the oldest living species in the known galaxy sent their most revered elder to claim the blade, he failed like all the others. 2 standard years went by. Over 40 species attempted the trial. Warriors, scientists, priests, kings, and philosophers all stood before the blade of ethos and tried to prove their worth. Some used strength. Some used technology. Some used faith. None of them succeeded. The sword remained in the crystal pedestal, shimmering with its strange light, waiting for someone who had not yet arrived. Rumors began to spread. Some said the sword was a trick, a precursor joke designed to humble the arrogant races of the galaxy. Others said the worthy one had not yet been born. A few whispered that perhaps the precursors had made a mistake, that no species in the universe could meet their impossible standards. Meanwhile, on a small blue planet at the edge of the galaxy, a species that most coalition members had never heard of was preparing to send its first representative to attempt the trial. They were called humans. They came from a world named Earth, and nobody expected anything from them at all. Humanity had only discovered faster-than-light travel 60 years ago. In the grand timeline of the galaxy, they were infants, a species that had barely learned to walk among the stars. They controlled a handful of small colonies, maintained a tiny diplomatic presence on the coalition station, and were generally ignored by the older and more powerful races. When the Coalition Science Council issued an open invitation for any remaining species to attempt the trial of the blade of ethos, most humans had never even heard of the sword. The news reached Earth through official channels, was discussed briefly by government officials, and was almost forgotten entirely. But refused to let it go was the human ambassador to the Galactic Coalition. She was 52 years old, with gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She had spent her entire career fighting for humanity's place in a galaxy that did not take them seriously. When she read about the trial, she saw an opportunity. She submitted a formal request for humanity to participate. The response was immediate and humiliating. The council members laughed openly during the session. A representative stood up and called the request an insult to the sacred nature of the trial. How dare these primitive creatures compare themselves to the great warriors and thinkers who had already failed? Humans were weak, short-lived, and unremarkable in every way. They had no business standing before the blade of ethos. Kept her expression calm throughout the mockery. When the laughter died down, she simply pointed to the coalition charter. The rules were clear. Any member species had the right to participate in open trials. Humanity was a member species. Therefore, humanity had the right to participate. The council could not argue with their own laws. The request was approved. Earth assembled a small delegation aboard a research vessel called the Meridian. The ship was nothing impressive by galactic standards, a mid-sized craft with basic defensive systems and a crew of 37. The mission commander was a woman named Laura, a veteran of the early colonial expeditions. She had a reputation for staying calm under pressure and getting her people home safely. Among the crew was an engineer named Danny Cole. Danny was 34 years old. He had grown up in a small town in Nebraska, surrounded by flat farmland and endless sky. His grandfather had been a farmer, a quiet man who believed in hard work and never giving up. Danny had learned to fix tractors before he learned to drive. He had a talent for understanding how things worked and making them work better. He joined the merchant fleet at 19 because he wanted to see the stars. He spent 15 years traveling between Earth and the colonies, repairing engines, patching hull breaches, and solving problems that nobody else could solve. He was not famous. He was not special. He was just a man who knew how to work with his hands and never complained about the hard parts. When the Meridian crew was asked for volunteers to attempt the trial, Danny raised his hand. Laura looked at him with surprise. She knew Danny as a reliable worker, someone who showed up on time and did his job without drama. She had never seen him seek attention or glory. When she asked him why he wanted to volunteer, he thought about it for a long moment before answering. He said that he had been reading about the trial. He had watched the recordings of the general and the priestess and all the others who had failed. Something about the sword interested him. He did not claim to be worthy. He did not believe he would succeed where so many others had failed. He just wanted to try. Laura considered his request. The coalition expected nothing from humanity anyway. They were sending a delegation as a matter of principle, not because anyone believed they had a chance. One volunteer was as good as another. She approved his request. The journey to Seven took 3 weeks. During that time, Laura briefed the crew on what to expect. The temple had become a place of pilgrimage for the entire galaxy. Observation platforms surrounded the central chamber. Millions of beings watched each attempt through broadcast systems. Betting markets had formed around the trial, with odds calculated for every remaining species that had not yet tried. Humanity's odds were the lowest of all. Some betting services refused to accept wagers on humans at all, considering the outcome too certain to qualify as gambling. Danny spent most of the journey in the engine room, running maintenance checks and reading everything he could find about the precursors. Not much was known about them. They had vanished 3 million years ago, leaving behind only scattered ruins and mysterious artifacts. Some scientists believed they had ascended to a higher plane of existence. Others thought they had destroyed themselves in a great war. The truth was lost to time. The Blade of Ethos was the most significant precursor artifact ever discovered. The inscriptions on the pedestal suggested it was not merely a weapon, but a symbol of something greater. Only the worthy shall wield the Blade of Ethos. Danny read those words over and over, trying to understand what they meant. What made someone worthy? Strength had not worked. Intelligence had not worked. Psionic power had not worked. Faith had not worked. Technology had not worked. The sword had rejected every form of greatness the galaxy had to offer. Danny did not consider himself great in any way. He was just an engineer from Nebraska who fixed broken things. The Meridian arrived at 7 on a cold gray morning. The moon looked lifeless from orbit, a ball of ice and rock with no atmosphere and no signs of life except for the coalition installations that had been built around the temple site. Shuttles carried the human delegation down to the surface, where they were met by an escort and led to their assigned quarters. They treated them with polite indifference. They did not acknowledge them at all. A few observers studied them with curiosity, scanning their minds and finding nothing remarkable. Danny looked up at the frozen landscape and felt the weight of history pressing down on him. Somewhere beneath his feet was a temple older than human civilization itself. Inside that temple was a sword that had defeated every champion the galaxy could offer. Tomorrow, he would stand before it and try to do what no one else had done. He was not afraid. He was not confident either. He simply accepted that he would try his best and see what happened. That was how his grandfather had taught him to face every challenge in life. Laura found him that evening, standing alone near a viewport, watching the stars. She asked if he was ready. Danny nodded slowly. He said he did not know if he was worthy. He said he did not even know what worthy meant. But he had come this far, and he was not going to walk away without trying. Laura put a hand on his shoulder and told him that was good enough. The temple was cold and dark and ancient beyond measure. Danny felt its age pressing against him as he walked through the winding corridors, following the escort toward the central chamber. The walls were covered in symbols that seemed to shift and move in the corner of his eye. The air smelled like dust and forgotten time. Laura walked beside him, her face calm but her eyes watchful. Behind them came the rest of the human delegation, a small group of diplomats and scientists who had been invited to observe the trial. Coalition security officers flanked them on both sides, their weapons visible but pointed downward. The corridor opened into the chamber. Danny had seen images of this place during his research. He had watched recordings of the failed attempts, but nothing had prepared him for the experience of standing there himself. The room was enormous. The ceiling rose so high that it disappeared into darkness. The walls curved inward like the inside of a giant egg, and in the center, surrounded by observation platforms filled with thousands of watching aliens, stood the crystal pedestal with the sword embedded inside. The blade of ethos glowed with soft light, colors shifting across its surface like oil on water. The hilt rose from the crystal at a perfect angle, as if inviting someone to reach out and take hold. The inscriptions around the base seemed to pulse with each beat of Danny's heart. The observation platforms fell silent as the humans entered. Danny could feel countless eyes turning toward him, studying him, judging him. He heard whispers in languages he did not understand. A few laughed, low, rumbling sounds that echoed off the ancient walls. An official stepped forward and addressed the assembly. He spoke in the common tongue of the coalition, his voice amplified by hidden technology. The official announced that the humans of Earth had requested to attempt the trial of the Blade of Ethos. He noted that this was their right under coalition law. He stated the volunteer's name and species for the record. Then he stepped aside and gestured for Danny to approach the pedestal. Danny walked forward alone. His boots made soft sounds on the stone floor. The distance from the entrance to the pedestal was perhaps 50 meters, but it felt like a journey across worlds. With each step, the whispers from the platforms grew louder. He heard disbelief. He heard mockery. He heard pity. He ignored it all and kept walking. When he reached the pedestal, he stopped and looked at the sword. Up close, it was even more beautiful than he had imagined. The blade was impossibly thin, almost translucent, yet he could sense the strength within it. The hilt seemed to be made of a dozen different materials woven together in patterns that made no logical sense but felt completely right. Danny thought about his grandfather. The old man had died when Danny was 17. He had spent his whole life on that farm in Nebraska, working the land through drought and flood, through good years and bad. He had never been wealthy. He had never been famous. But he had taught Danny something that no amount of money or power could buy. He had taught him that real strength was not about winning. It was about getting up every time you fell down. It was about doing the work even when no one was watching. It was about facing the impossible and trying anyway, not because you expected to succeed, but because trying was the right thing to do. Danny reached out and wrapped his fingers around the hilt of the sword. The moment he touched it, he felt something change. A warmth spread through his hand up his arm into his chest. It was not painful. It was not frightening. It felt like coming home after a long journey. He pulled. The sword slid free from the crystal pedestal, as smoothly as a knife cutting through butter. For a long moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The entire chamber seemed frozen in time. Then the chaos began. Scientists rushed forward, their instruments flashing and beeping. Warriors roared with disbelief, demanding an explanation. Priests dropped to their knees, their minds overwhelmed by what they had witnessed. A wave of sound crashed through the chamber, voices shouting in 100 different languages. Danny stood in the center of it all, holding the blade of ethos, looking as confused as everyone else. Laura pushed through the crowd to reach him. She stared at the sword in his hand, then at his face, then back at the sword. For the first time in 20 years of military service, she had no idea what to say. The official called for order, but nobody listened. Coalition security officers formed a protective ring around the human delegation, their weapons raised against the pressing crowd. The champion pushed forward, his eyes fixed on Danny with an expression that mixed rage with something else, something that might have been wonder. A senior coalition administrator finally managed to restore some control. She ordered the chamber cleared, and the human delegation escorted to secure quarters. The sword, she declared, would remain with Danny until the council could convene and determine the proper course of action. As Danny walked toward the exit, still holding the blade, the crowd parted before him. Creatures that had dismissed humanity as insignificant now looked at him with new eyes. Some showed respect. Some showed fear. Some showed hunger, calculating what this moment might mean for the balance of power in the galaxy. Danny did not care about any of that. He was still trying to understand what had happened. He had expected to fail. He had been prepared to walk away with nothing, just another name added to the long list of species that had tried and lost. Instead, he was carrying an artifact that had defeated every great champion in the known galaxy. Laura walked beside him, her hand resting on her sidearm, ready for any threat. She leaned close and asked him how he felt. Danny looked down at the sword. The blade still shimmered with that strange shifting light, but now it felt familiar somehow, like a tool he had been using all his life. He said he felt fine. He said it felt right. Laura nodded slowly. She did not fully understand, but she accepted his answer. Behind them, the chamber echoed with the sound of alien voices debating, arguing, demanding answers. The galaxy had changed in a single moment. Nothing would ever be the same again. And somewhere deep within the crystal pedestal, in the empty space where the sword had rested for 3 million years, a faint glow pulsed once, twice, and then faded into darkness forever. The news spread across the galaxy faster than any starship could travel. Within hours of Danny lifting the sword, every inhabited world in the coalition knew what had happened. A human, a member of the youngest and weakest species in known space, had succeeded where the mightiest champions of 100 civilizations had failed. The reaction was immediate and intense. Crowds gathered in the streets to demand an explanation. How could a soft, fragile creature accomplish what their greatest warrior could not? Some called for an investigation. Others called for war. The military council met in emergency session, their debates loud enough to shake the walls of their ancient fortress. The Empire issued a formal statement questioning the legitimacy of the trial. Perhaps the sword had been damaged during the 2 years of failed attempts. Perhaps the humans had used some unknown technology to cheat. Perhaps the entire event had been staged by political enemies seeking to embarrass the coalition's founding members. They were divided. Some of their priests believed that humanity had been chosen by the precursors for a sacred purpose. Others argued that the trial had been a mistake, that the sword had malfunctioned after of dormancy. A few whispered that perhaps their understanding of worthiness had been wrong all along. Meanwhile, on 7, Danny sat in a small room in the Coalition security complex and wondered what he was supposed to do next. The sword lay on the table in front of him. It still glowed with that shifting light, still beautiful, still impossible. Security officers had tried to take it from him when he first arrived, but they had quickly discovered that the blade refused to cooperate. When anyone else touched the hilt, the sword became impossibly heavy, cold as deep space, and painful to hold. Only in Danny's hands did it behave like a normal weapon. The Coalition sent their best scientists to study him. They scanned his body with every instrument available. They tested his blood, his bones, his brain. They measured his strength, his reflexes, his mental patterns. They compared his results to the records of every other being who had attempted the trial. They found nothing special. Danny was a healthy human male in his mid-30s. His physical capabilities were average for his species. His mental abilities showed no psionic potential. His genetic code contained no hidden markers or anomalies. By every measurable standard, he was completely ordinary. This only made the mystery deeper. Doctor was a scientist assigned to lead the investigation. She had spent 40 years studying precursor artifacts and considered herself the foremost expert on their technology. The failure of her instruments to explain Danny's success frustrated her deeply. She sat across from him in the examination room, her 4 hands folded on the table, her silver eyes studying his face. She asked him what he had done differently from the others. Danny thought about the question. He had watched the recordings of the previous attempts many times. He remembered the general straining with all his massive strength. He remembered the priestess reaching out with her powerful mind. He remembered warriors and scholars and priests, all of them approaching the sword with absolute certainty that they deserved to claim it. He said that maybe he had not done anything different. Maybe that was the point. Doctor did not understand. She asked him to explain. Danny picked up the sword from the table. It felt natural in his hand, balanced and light. He said that everyone else had tried to conquer the blade. They had approached it as a challenge to be overcome, an enemy to be defeated. They believed they were worthy because of their strength or their wisdom or their power. They believed they deserved the sword because of what they had accomplished. He said that he had not believed any of those things. He had just reached out and picked it up, the same way he would pick up any tool he needed for a job. He had not tried to prove anything. He had not demanded anything. He had simply asked in the silence of his own mind if the sword would come with him. And it had. Doctor recorded his words but could not process their meaning. In her experience, power came from superiority, from being greater than others. The idea that power might come from humility made no sense to her understanding of the universe. The days passed. Danny remained in the Coalition complex, surrounded by security and scientists and diplomats. Laura visited him whenever she could, bringing news from the outside world. Earth had become the center of galactic attention. The human government was overwhelmed with communication requests from species that had never bothered to speak with them before. Trade offers, alliance proposals, and threats arrived in equal measure. Some alien powers wanted to befriend humanity. Others wanted to destroy them before they became too powerful. Worked without sleep, managing the diplomatic crisis. She understood that this moment would define humanity's future in the galaxy. Every word, every decision, every gesture mattered. She came to see Danny on the 7th day after the trial. Told him that the Coalition Council had debated his case for 3 days. Some members wanted to take the sword by force, regardless of its strange behavior. Others wanted to exile humanity from the Coalition entirely. A few suggested that Danny should be killed to prevent any one species from controlling such a powerful artifact. In the end, the Coalition Charter prevailed. The sword had chosen Danny according to the rules of the trial. It belonged to him by law. Any attempt to take it would violate the principles that held the Coalition together. Danny asked what was supposed to happen next. Sat down across from him. She looked tired, older than her years, worn down by the weight of responsibility. She said that was exactly what she had come to ask him. The galaxy was watching. Humanity's future depended on what Danny chose to do with the power he now held. He could demand wealth, territory, political influence. He could make Earth into a major galactic power overnight. He could reshape the balance of the Coalition with a single word. Danny looked at the sword in his hand. He thought about his grandfather, working the fields day after day, never asking for more than what he earned through his own labor. He thought about the life he had lived, fixing engines and solving problems, finding satisfaction in simple work done well. He said he did not want any of those things. Stared at him for a long moment. Then she smiled, the first genuine smile she had allowed herself in weeks. She said that was exactly the right answer. 3 months after Danny Cole lifted the blade of ethos, the coalition linguists finally completed their translation of the temple inscriptions. What they discovered changed everything the galaxy believed about the precursors and their ancient test. The inscriptions told a story that stretched back to the dawn of galactic civilization. The precursors had been the first species to achieve interstellar travel. They had explored the galaxy when it was young and empty, mapping stars that had no names and cataloging worlds that had never known intelligent life. For millions of years, they watched and waited as new species emerged, evolved, and reached for the stars. And they grew afraid. Not afraid of war or conquest or destruction. They had technology far beyond anything the younger species could imagine. No one could threaten them. What they feared was something more subtle and more dangerous. They feared what power did to those who held it. The precursors had watched countless civilizations rise and fall. They saw the pattern repeat again and again. A species would develop intelligence, then technology, then the ability to travel between worlds. And somewhere along that journey, they would lose something essential. They would become arrogant. They would believe that strength gave them the right to dominate others. They would forget what it meant to be humble, to be curious, to face the universe with wonder instead of greed. Power corrupted. It always had, it always would. So the precursors created a test. They forged the blade of ethos and left it on the frozen moon of 7, waiting for the species that would come after them. They designed the sword to reject anyone who approached it with pride, with certainty, with the belief that they deserved power because of what they had already achieved. They were looking for something different. They were looking for a species that had not yet been corrupted by its own success. A species young enough to still remember struggle, still know failure, still approach the unknown with humility instead of arrogance. They were looking for beings who would pick up the sword not to prove their greatness, but simply because it needed to be picked up. When Danny Cole wrapped his fingers around the hilt, the ancient consciousness within the blade looked into his soul. It did not find a warrior seeking glory. It did not find a priest seeking validation. It did not find a king seeking power. It found a man who fixed broken things because they needed to be fixed. A man who got up every morning and did his work without expecting praise or reward. A man who had been taught by his grandfather that the measure of a person was not what they achieved, but how they treated others along the way. The sword recognized him. The sword chose him. The sword came home. Danny did not fully understand any of this. When the translations were finally released to the public, he read them with the same quiet attention he gave to everything else. He did not claim to be special. He did not believe that he represented all of humanity. He simply accepted that something strange had happened and tried to live with it as best he could. But the galaxy saw things differently. They sent a delegation to Earth, requesting permission to study with human teachers. They wanted to understand the quality they had mistaken for weakness. Their warrior culture had always celebrated strength above all else, but now they wondered if strength alone was not enough. Perhaps there was wisdom in the human way of facing challenges without pride, of working without demanding recognition. The Empire opened new diplomatic channels with humanity. They did not apologize for their previous mockery, but they treated Earth as an equal for the first time. Trade agreements were negotiated. Cultural exchanges were arranged. Scholars traveled to human universities to study the strange species that had accomplished the impossible. The priests incorporated human philosophy into their teachings. They studied the simple lessons that Danny's grandfather had passed down on that farm in Nebraska. They meditated on the meaning of persistence, of humility, of doing the work even when no one was watching. Some of them found new peace in these ideas. Others struggled to understand how something so simple could be so powerful. Danny became an ambassador, though he never asked for the title. He traveled across the galaxy with the blade of ethos at his side, meeting with leaders and common people alike. He spoke to crowds of thousands and to individuals seeking guidance. He never claimed to have answers. He simply shared what he knew and listened to what others had to say. Some beings approached him with hostility, resenting what humanity had achieved. Others came with greed, seeking to use his influence for their own purposes. A few tried to kill him, believing that the sword's power could be transferred by force. The blade protected him each time, flashing with light and driving the attackers away. But most beings who met Danny found something unexpected. They found an ordinary man doing his best in extraordinary circumstances. They found someone who treated them with respect regardless of their species or status. They found a reminder of what they might have been before power and age had changed them. Years passed. Danny grew older. Gray appeared in his hair, lines deepened around his eyes. He married a woman named Helen who worked as a doctor on the Coalition Medical Station. They had 2 children who grew up surrounded by aliens and wondered why everyone made such a fuss about their father. He never stopped working. Even as humanity's greatest symbol, he found time to repair broken equipment, to solve problems that others could not solve, to do the simple work that had always given him satisfaction. The sword rested at his side, patient and content, waiting for whatever came next. When Danny Cole finally died at the age of 83, the blade released itself from his grip for the first time since the trial. It floated above his body for a moment, glowing with soft light, then vanished in a flash that was seen across the entire star system. No one knew where it went. Some believed it had returned to the temple on Seven to wait for another worthy soul. Others thought it had traveled to some distant corner of the galaxy to find the next species that was ready for its gift. A few whispered that the sword had never been a weapon at all, but a teacher, and that its lessons had finally been learned. Humanity mourned Danny, but they did not forget what he had taught them. They carried his example forward into the centuries that followed, remembering that true strength came not from power but from how you used it. And somewhere beyond the edge of known space, in dimensions that mortal minds could not comprehend, the precursors watched their children grow. They had waited 3 million years for someone worthy. They had not been disappointed.